So I'm going to suggest that thus far what we've provided has the makings of a defense. That is to say, the no mountains without valleys idea seems to offer a defense in the sense that it helps us understand the existence of some moral or physical evil in the world that in a way that shows it to be compatible with the existence of a greatest conceivable being. One might say the fact that there is at least a little bit of evil in the world in human history, both in the past as well as what's happening now, is compatible with the existence of a GCB, because you might say, if there had been never, at any time in human history, any evil at all, then virtues such as compassion, mercy, perseverance, courage, forgiveness, etc., would never have been realized. We wouldn't have had any need for these things, but then the world would have been more bland in some respect. So therefore, one can understand how a certain amount of evil is compatible with the existence of a GCB. But it's natural to reply now, look, you only need a little tiny bit of suffering of various kinds in order to actualize these virtues that we just mentioned a moment ago. We have a whole lot more evil than that. That is to say, much more is going to be required to show that the line of thought here constitutes a theodicy. That is an explanation for the existence of all the moral and physical evil in the world compatible with the existence of a GCB. Just think back, too, the amount of starvation, famine, plague, malaria, utter and total warfare, genocide, etc., that the human race has suffered through, and I'm not even mentioning in my definition of evil, but of course it applies to, in principle, the evil that non-human animals have to experience as well. Think about how vast that is. Think about how huge that is, and how it sure seems like there's a great deal more of that evil, the suffering that the evil brings with it, regardless of its cause, a great deal more than is required to realize the virtues that we've mentioned thus far. You might be able to come up with a list of virtues that goes beyond the one that I've constructed, and thereby be able to justify the existence of perhaps more types of evil than I've considered, but I still suspect that you'll have to do a great deal more to make it compatible with the actual amount of evil that weighs down on the world as I speak. So we need to ask the question, is there a hope for going from anything like a defense to that of a theodicy? Now, in the article, Must God Create the Best?, Robert Adams, a philosopher, asks the following question. He wants to ask if the following proposition, call it P, is really true. It's something that's been in the back of our thinking thus far, I suspect. P goes as follows. If a perfectly good moral agent created any world at all, it would have to be the very best possible world that it could create. We're assuming that if you create any world at all, if you're a perfectly good moral agent, you create the best world that you're capable of creating. This is something that it's very natural to think is true. And if P is true, then the GCB is obligated to create the best world that it's capable of creating, even if doing so requires that there be a little bit of evil, given the defense that we've discussed thus far. But is that really true? Must it really be the case that the GCB has got to create the best world that it's capable of creating? So Adams suggests, in choosing to create a world with moral or physical evil, where the GCB could have created one with less evil, must the GCB in so doing be less than perfectly benevolent? That is, if the GCB says, I could create a world up here, but I'm going to create a world that's not quite as good as that one, does that show that the GCB is therefore less than perfectly benevolent, that is, not omnibenevolent? If so, then that would only be because the GCB is either wronging one of the creatures in the world that it creates, or the GCB has shown some kind of perversity in creating the world that it does. That is to say, when I choose to create one situation rather than another, I might in my decision either hurt some creature that exists, I've harmed it, I've made its life less than it could be, for example. Or if I create a world, perhaps I create an imaginary world by virtue of drawings or something I just contemplate in my mind's eye, or I write a story. You might say there are no actual agents that are suffering in this world because they're all fictional, but you might say, nevertheless, creating such a world shows that there's something perverse about me. If I create a bunch of stories in which people suffer unutterable pain all the time, one might wonder whether that reflects back on something strange about me. So if I create a world in some way that's either an actual world or a possible world, and it's less than what it might have been, it has a certain amount of evil in it, you might ask, what does that show about me? Have I wronged someone, or has it shown the kind of perversity in me? Let's get an example of the sort that Adam suggests. I could choose, suppose I'm deciding whether or not, I'm in a pet shop, I'm deciding whether or not I want to raise goldfish on the one hand or puppies on the other. Let's see, what should I decide to bring home today? A goldfish or a puppy? Well, I might think, goldfish are nice, puppies are cute, puppies are more work, puppies are more interesting perhaps because they turn into, when they grow up, or even when they're still puppies, they're more emotional and they form tighter bonds and so forth. But suppose that I decided to go with the goldfish instead. So I start to create goldfish. I, so to speak, create a goldfish world rather than a puppy world. Now, here's a question that Adams would want us to consider. Have I done something morally wrong in so doing? Have I erred in some way by creating a goldfish world rather than a puppy world? I want you to reflect on that question for a moment. Ask yourself, if I've done something wrong, well, who have I wronged, or have I shown a perversity? If I decide to create a goldfish world and not a puppy world, then let's suppose that the puppy still goes home with some other owner, so it's not as if the puppy has to suffer. Then I haven't harmed the puppy in so doing. And suppose that when I bring the goldfish home, I create a perfectly nice, pleasant fish tank environment for the goldfish. It's not clear that I've done something immoral in choosing as I have. That is, if I choose to raise goldfish rather than puppies, it's not clear that that choice betrays a moral defect in me. You might say, look, you could have created a more interesting, more wonderful world, but the fact that I didn't does not show that I've harmed somebody. I haven't harmed the puppy, because the puppy still has a good life. I haven't harmed the goldfish. I'm taking good care of the goldfish. It's not clear that I've shown any perversity in the way that I would have shown if I spin out a bunch of stories in which people suffer or other creatures suffer terribly. So where is the immorality of my choosing to create the goldfish world as opposed to the puppy world, as it were? I haven't wronged anybody, nor have I shown any perversity in doing as I have. But then it's not clear, Adams will suggest, that I have done something wrong. But notice that this has implications for his proposition P, because proposition P says if a GCB is going to create any world at all, then the GCB could create the best world that it could create. Adams is saying, I actually think we should give up on proposition P, because that would imply that if you're going to create either of the two goldfish or puppy worlds, you're obliged to create the puppy world, whereas Adams would say you can, but if you choose to create the goldfish world instead, that does not show that there's anything immoral in that choice. Adams builds on top of this thought the idea of grace. This is a moral attribute consisting in loving someone or something regardless of its imperfections. A graceful host, for example, is kind and thoughtful and considerate of his or her guests at a dinner party, for example, regardless of whether or not they're behaving properly, and appreciates them for what they are with all their imperfections and foibles. So too a graceful God, Adams will say, loves its creatures whether or not they're as great and wonderful and nice and sophisticated as they could be. Goldfish, that is to say, as opposed to puppies. So the GCB could display grace in loving a world full of creatures that are less perfect than they might have been. Goldfish-type creatures rather than puppy-like creatures. Human beings that often err, often perform acts of evil of various kinds, as opposed to human beings that are one and all moral saints, as it were. So I could love those goldfish fully and in full knowledge of their inferiority to puppies, and in so doing create a world that's less perfect than it might have been, but it's not at all clear that I've done something immoral as long as I meet these conditions. Adams will say, structurally speaking, the situation is similar between the goldfish puppy example and the case in which a GCB creates a world that's much less perfect than it might have been.